What do you think?
Oh, I think you're going to answer all the questions we raised.
Well, I'm gonna put some deeper questions as well. I recently wrote an article on Jung and Nietzsche. Obviously, that article is my view, is the subjective. Although I have supported by a lot of quotes from Jung and Nietzsche from their literature. There was always something troubling me with those two guys. And as you said, Nietzsche was a huge inspiration first for Freud, and it's quite questionable statement by Freud saying that he never read Nietzsche, right? And actually, he quoted him 18 times in his dreams, in famous book on dreams. Also, he said that he never come across anybody who understood himself better and more than Nietzsche did. So I wonder, how do you know that? If you never read Nietzsche, where do you get it from? And yeah, there's a big story going on. Also in 1899, he was about to publish his book on dreams, but he didn't want to do that. He said, the next century is mine. So he published it in 1900, just in order to conquer the new century, because the previous one obviously belongs to Nietzsche. The similar story applies to Jung. Jung is more honest in relation to Nietzsche. He is saying in his correspondence to Freud, he is saying that actually in the letter that Nietzsche has done so much about subconscious and Dionysus, which then later Jung translated into Wotan. And he was impressed by him. By the way, Freud was part of the group during his studies. That group was especially targeting discussion on Schopenhauer, Wagner, and Nietzsche for 5 years. So obviously they've read a lot, so they knew about Nietzsche a lot. But well, I threw all my passion into that article, so I'm not going to go into that now. Whoever wants to read it, maybe I have a talk on that subject alone. But what I like to say is that water is always clearest at its source, and as the river goes down to the sea, the water becomes dirty. So I would always stick to originals. And when people ask me, "Oh, I'm thinking about reading philosophy, what do you think?" I always try to stick to originals, to the big guns, if you want, in a way. Now Nietzsche appeared in the world of philosophy as a storm. Obviously heavily influenced by Schopenhauer and Kant. He didn't come out of nowhere. He had a good ground. But Nietzsche also says that his only and great teacher was up to Schopenhauer. He agreed with him in many instances, but he also criticized him a lot. At the end, he completely changed his mind and criticized and rejected a lot of Schopenhauer's ideas. But being a storm, in a way, as he says himself, what I write in a sentence, other people can write in a book. Actually, other people can't write at all. That's a typical. So this is why it's difficult reading Nietzsche and understanding Nietzsche. And I saw Jung as a bridge between Nietzsche and, if I may use that word, modernity, modern world. Because Nietzsche is very difficult to comprehend. Reading Nietzsche is like reading aphorisms. Sometimes they are not connected, they have nothing to do with each other. But every aphorism is a book on its own. I mean, every single aphorism, either you take it from Beyond Good and Evil, on genealogy morals, or gay science, or you just drift in any direction. You can take an aphorism and discuss that for days. It's very, he says, "I'm a dynamite," in his autobiography. Basically, his thoughts are extremely pregnant with meaning. And Jung has done a great favor to the world, using them, diluting them, and made them more palatable for, in a way, mass market. And this is how I see psychology today. Everything that came after Nietzsche was a very strong wine diluted with water. unoffered people, and then people understand that it's really, really original good wine, but it's not. It's just diluted. There's only a drop of real deal in that drink. So what I'm trying to do in my presentations of Nietzsche, I try to explain the propensity of the thought and the depth of the meaning in every single area of his involvement. The most complicated, obviously, being aesthetics. Now tonight we're talking about soul and spirituality, and Nietzsche has, in many different occasions, rejected lots of theories and lots of teaching hitherto, and also he rejected the theory of soul being atomistic soul, being a monad, being something single, indestructible, indivisible, and also immortal. And this thought prevailed in philosophy before him, especially Descartes, Leibniz. So for Nietzsche, that wasn't right, that wasn't true, because he saw that soul is mortal, is the complexity of the subject, and also is the structure of drives. So obviously heavy wording, but I'll try to explain that. Now, what was the main argument about soul being an atomistic entity, being a monad, is that kind of soul is actually explanation. It explains the difference between us humans and animals. We can think because we have soul, right? And not just that, but we can also decide about the values. We can value things. We can decide what is good, what is bad, thanks to our soul. But then Nietzsche came and said, well, that doesn't say anything, because how do we come to the values? How do we decide what is good, what is bad? So basically he needed to answer the question, if soul is not an atomistic entity, what it is then? What is that complexity of the subject that he calls? When he tried to talk about values, he finds that actually explanation is psychologically deeper than our soul. There is something that comes before the soul. He doesn't want to eliminate completely the existence of the soul, but he is against the interpretation of the soul being an atomistic entity, a monad, indestructible, eternal, indivisible. Soul as a structure of drives and emotions. So there, you see, in analytical philosophy, it's extremely important to understand what a sentence brings inside. So there are two things, there are two concepts. One is social structure, and another one is drives. So soul, for Nietzsche, is a social structure of drives and emotions. So what would be the drives for Nietzsche? The other philosophers who entered the discussion about soul as tripartite division, Platonic division of the soul. Plato saw the soul made of three parts. First part of the soul is logos, the second one is timos, and the third one is eros. Logos, or logistikon in Greek, resides in the head, timos resides in the chest, and eros resides in the stomach. Now Plato says the following: Logos is responsible for rational thinking, timos is responsible for fear and anger, while eros is responsible for emotions and instincts. In that tripartite soul, logos is the most important, because it controls timos and eros. As it does in individuals, also it does in the society. So Plato says that the reason why sometimes we have individuals or societies which are not right, they are acting wrong, is because the logos doesn't dominate timos and eros. Actually, eros or timos are dominating instead of logos. But what Plato has done with this is actually went back to the atomistic theory of the soul because he simplifies the soul with the rational part. Now Nietzsche disagrees with that. There are drives, there is something much more deeper. So now, for Nietzsche understands drives as a set of behavioral dispositions that control and dominate our behavior and our actions, and they act beneath the surface of the consciousness. Now, some commentators, scholars try to identify drives with instincts, or desires, but that's not the case. Because while desires, for example, are goal-directed, goal-oriented, drives are not. They are directed by expression, and they are constant. For example, sexual desire can be satisfied, and then we are done with it. But drive for procreation is constant, and it finds its existence, its direction in the expression, not in the goal. So this is the difference between the drives and desires. So we can't identify them like that. So how Nietzsche says this is the social structure of the drive. So what does social structure means? How they are organized. Nietzsche says that we are made of a multiplicity of drives. There are different drives in us. And now every single drive is tyrannical, wants to be a master, wants to dominate. And they are organized in a political order as a society. Simply the strongest, the most capable to lead drives are the dominant ones. The other ones, which are not dominant, they have to find their place, like in the wolf pack. That's the leader, these wolves are in the middle, these ones on the sides, everybody does its function. But they are organized as a political structure. Nietzsche talks a lot about that political structure. I'm not going to go there, but it's the nature of the drives is every single drive wants to dominate. For example, you have a drive, procreation, which is pushing you to flirt with someone. But also you have a drive for friendship. So you know you can't flirt and be a friend. So you have to decide. Now the question is, who decides? Can you decide? Or the drives decide? Nietzsche thinks the drives decide. And if that drive for procreation is going to be stronger than the other one for friendship, you will be flirting. Because every time the drive wants to dominate other drives. And this is the nature, and this is our nature. And that operates beneath the surface of consciousness. So now the question arises, what do we do with our consciousness? Are we capable of changing anything? In Genealogy and Morality, Nietzsche talks about how we came up to developing the drives and how we came up to getting to this situation that we have a problem with that. And he describes in Genealogy that the humans in the beginning were free. They enjoyed freedom, complete freedom. And the reason for that is because every single drive could have expressed itself outward. Now, with the development of the society, that free man has been imprisoned within the walls of the society, and his expression of the drives was usually sanctioned. So you can't behave, you can't just fight or kill anybody or just rape or whatever you want to do. Now the society implements the rules. And the problem that we have is that the free drives, those that complete freedom, which is actually for him freedom of the drives, were now changed with outward expression of the drives, change into inward expression of the drives. So they can't get out of us, so they're coming back into us. And we have a problem with that. And this is what Nietzsche calls bad conscience. Bad conscience actually is the human condition. This is where all the psychological problems originate. So when I said about the source, why the water is the clearest there? Because when we get to the source, Nietzsche was the first one to introduce, for example, the concept of sublimation before Freud. And guess whose that term is nowadays? Everybody knows it. Freud introduced it, but it's not. In Beyond Good and Evil, he used it first time. And it talks about sublimation of sexual instinct. Hence, Freud comes later and says, well, I never read that guy. You know? So the source is always that powerful. This is why I'm insisting on understanding of these thoughts and the depth. So we have a social structure, we have drives. It's very important to understand it. And he says the deep sickness into which man had to fall under the pressure of the most fundamental of all changes he ever experienced. Deep sickness. For him, the man has become sick. Because he can't express his drives. He has to suppress them. He has to sublimate. But that comes with a cost. And the cost is, as modern psychology understands, psychosis, neurosis, depression, aggression, etc., etc. But the root of those causes is right in the drives and the social structure, and also in the development of the same. One of the major issues that I have with Jung, and I have to say that because this is how I'm going to finish my part, is that individuation in Jung is actually the process in which you understand, your ego understands the shadow, right? You acknowledge what is going on in you, what are those dark forces in you. Freud has helped us to understand that through the dreams, Jung as well, we can reach into the depth of our shadow or subconscious. But Jung stops there, right? He stops there. Nietzsche talks about the dreams as well before Jung. And he says, in one dream I was very humorous, in another one I was gloomy, and then in the third one I was adventurous. And he says, why is that? Why am I'm different in every different dream? Because different drives dominate myself, my soul, because I'm asleep, I'm not conscious. So the drives are free. So the only time when drives are free are actually in our dreams. All right? But then it comes even worse. He says, actually, we can say that there is no difference between dreaming and awakened state. Because even when we are awake, our drives are still working. And our experiences, as I mentioned before we started talking, experience of the things around us in the outside world are not necessarily what happens in the world, but what we make out of it. So we are making our experiences. And why is that, he says? Take, for example, somebody in the market, a man who is singing. Different people are looking at that man. Somebody likes the song. Somebody doesn't like the song. Somebody comments. Somebody hates the song. Somebody is going to think and sing the song for days. He says, why is that? Because different people create different experiences. And it looks like the same experience, but it's not. So he goes even that way. Now the question, again, we have individuation as a cardinal point in Jung's teaching, and his analytical psychoanalysis. Understanding of the shadow, putting things together. Fine. Now what? What do you do then? He stops there. Now what Nietzsche says? Nietzsche says clearly in Aphorism 219, Gay Science, he says, what is needed is to give style to one's character. He doesn't stop there. He doesn't stop. And he says that is a rare and fine art. Is a rare It's not for everybody, and it's fine. You really need to be very sensitive for that. And it says it's practiced by those who are able to enter and discover their strengths and weaknesses. That's the shadow. But it doesn't stop there. And then Nietzsche says, and then give them an artistic plan. And that giving an artistic plan, as I said earlier on, aesthetic is the most complicated part of Nietzschean philosophy, is the crux of the problem. How do we give aesthetic plan to our strengths and weaknesses, in which he says, even the ugly pleases the eye. So it requires huge effort, huge effort. Roger will recall, I often speak, I wrote about it in my book, The Lifestyle Change, that my understanding is that we exist in three areas of existence: physical, intellectual, and spiritual. So now, how do we deal aesthetically? What is aesthetics? What is soul and what is spirituality? Where that belongs? What is the difference between physical, intellectual, and spiritual? What is intellectual cannot be spiritual, and vice versa. So, intellectual is necessary for us to understand positive argument that we exist in three different shapes as physical, intellectual, and spiritual. Without intellectual, we can't get there. But then without intellectual, we can't even get to the spiritual, because we cannot communicate. For Nietzsche, consciousness is nothing but skill of communication. Nothing more than that. Not fancy expressions in exotic philosophies. No, is way of communication. We don't create consciousness. We are thrown into the consciousness as ideas. Do I create ideas, or idea creates me? Heidegger says, we don't speak language. Language speaks us. You know, we got thrown in the world, and here there is Italian language, and you speak Italian. Or there is English, and you speak English. The language is there waiting for you, to use you, because language needs to continue. It is using you to continue existing. You are doing nothing there. What is consciousness? The same thing is there. So you come out and you look around, and this is what allows you to communicate. Now, what is subconscious? That's the problem. How do you get there? Drives, dreams. But you can't get there without intellectual optimization of yourself. This is why I said it so many times, and I will keep saying that, who knows, one day it may happen. People need to educate themselves constantly. One doesn't finish education with a degree, with a PhD. Education never stops. For an intellectual, it never stops. It's like a drive. It's concerned with the expression, not with the goal. But no reading, no education. No philosophy, no education. Sorry. That's the difference between knowledge and wisdom. What's the difference between knowledge and wisdom? Kant said once, science teaches us how to think, but wisdom teaches us how to live. So most of the people have enough knowledge about a particular area. They gathered enough information about X and Z. But do really they know how to live? Do they know what is the meaning of life? Why are they here? What is their purpose? Why everything is? Imagine if everything wasn't. There is nothing there. What I'm doing here. So life is an extremely important opportunity. And this is when we start getting into that spiritual area, which is not intellectual. Areas where we are experiencing other people or ourselves in a way which is not intellectual. Like, for example, friendship, love. I spoke about it in the Jesus and Nietzsche lecture. Love. What is intellectual about love? If you put your intellect into love, you're not loving. There's nothing to do with love. So it has to be something really spiritual, something which is, as Nietzsche would say, very difficult to translate in language. So everything we have tried to say tonight is an attempt to use our only tool that we have, which is language, to express something that we all have inside us, our passions, our drives. As Nietzsche says, to understand one philosopher, you have to understand the philosopher. For his philosophy, you need to understand the philosophy. So I think we've given you enough food for thought, and maybe we should have a short break now, so you can summarize your questions, and then we continue in 5 minutes, 10 minutes.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.